A union official was executed in his home not long after a strike by union membership. No one in the neighborhood heard any gunshots. It would take a forensic sound test, an electron microscope, and a nightgown to explain why. 39-year-old Joe Doyle was an official of the local AFSCME, a union representing government employees.
It could be the most bitter, cold day in the world, and if he thought you were cold, he'd take his shirt off and give it to you, even if he didn't know you. Now, he also, as big as he wasn't afraid to tell you exactly what he thought.
He got into people's faces. He was a wonderful guy. They either loved him or they might have hated him.
Joe and his wife, Katie, had been married for about 8 years. On July 30th, 1998, the couple went to a private club after work for drinks. Early the next morning, Katie phoned police in a panic.
County 911, what is your emergency? I need some help. My husband won't move and there's like blood around him and stuff. Did you hear him fall or anything? No, he's laying in bed on his stomach. I went in to wake him up for work. Okay. All right, we'll get somebody right there. Thank you. Don't touch anything. All right.
Joe Doyle had been shot at close range. It was an execution-style killing.
When someone's dead with four gunshot wounds to the head, the first question that anyone's going to ask is, did this person have enemies? Because obviously it wasn't a friend that did this.
There was no sign of forced entry, and Joe's empty money clip was on the floor, which according to Katie had contained approximately $1,800. The first suspect in a murder like this is always the surviving spouse. Katie's hands were tested for gunshot residue, which would have been present had she fired a gun. The test was negative. Katie told police that they got home from the club around 8:30, had dinner, then went to bed. Around midnight, Katie said she went to sleep in an adjacent bedroom.
It was because of Joe's really, really, really loud snoring that she couldn't take it. She tried to get to sleep and she lay there for an hour or so, but she finally had to leave and go into this next door bedroom because of the snoring.
The next morning, when Katie went in to wake her husband, she found him dead under the covers. Katie insisted she didn't hear any gunshots. Neither did any of her neighbors.
One of the funniest things in the case was that no one heard the gunshots. No one. We really did not have any good evidence of any hearing of gunshots that night.
It's possible a silencer could have been used. It could be a professional type of silencer that is affixed to the gun.
Police couldn't help but notice the amount of dust in the Doyles' home and wondered whether this might help track the killer's movements and ultimately reveal his identity. After the murder of 39-year-old Joe Doyle, friends and family told police that his marriage to wife Katie seemed solid. The couple were building an addition to their house and planning for the future.
Katie is telling the police that Joe was the love of her life, that she loved him more than you could love anyone, that everything was perfect in their marriage, that they just had sex the night before he was killed.
Joe and Katie both worked at the same hospital, and their co-workers gave police a different picture of their relationship.
Katie was having a brazen affair with a co-worker, that she was basically flaunting that relationship, that she told people that she was obsessed with Jordan, that she wanted nothing to do with her husband, that her husband was controlling, that George was the love of her life.
George Lewis was a groundskeeper at the hospital, and police found evidence the two were more than just lovers.
She purchases jewelry for him. She gives him a $1,000 down payment for a vehicle. She purchases clothing for him. She does everything for him, really.
Katie admitted the affair, but her lawyer says it meant nothing.
It was a fling. It was not brief, but it was not a motive for murder.
At the crime scene, police found a clue in the nightstand next to the bed. In the nightstand was a lockbox. Marks in the dust indicated the box had recently been moved, but no fingerprints were found. Missing from the box was Joe Doyle's 9mm Makarov pistol. This is one of the 4 bullets recovered from Doyle's body, deformed by impact. When a handgun is fired, the bullet spins as it travels through the barrel. The soft outer shell is scored by a corkscrew line cut into the barrel, a process known as rifling.
It causes the bullet to rotate on its longitudinal axis, given an aerodynamic stability while it's in flight.
The line cut into the bullet is called a groove. The spaces between the grooves are called lands. These lands and grooves are different for each make of gun. Investigators wanted to know whether this bullet was from a pistol like the one owned by Joe Doyle. Using a comparison microscope, forensic scientists compared the bullet from Joe Doyle's body to one fired from a Makarov pistol.
On the Makarov, it has 4 lands and grooves with the right twist. And there are not many firearms that have those class characteristics.
The results were clear. Joe had been killed with the same model 9mm pistol that he had once owned but was now missing.
The bullets were consistent with being fired from this model. So that was the evidence with the gun. That's what they started with. And on the defense side, we established that there were at least 3,000 other guns of this make and model alone that existed in our state, about 14,000 in the country.
Police then looked into Joe's union ties.
There recently had been a strike with the union, and the victim was involved in some of the activities regarding that strike.
It was a strike by state employees. Joe had the potentially dangerous task of repossessing the state-owned cars driven by the striking members.
People can be volatile, tempers flare up during a strike situation, one person against another. There could have been some problems between him and one of the people whose cars he repossessed.
Joe, in some sense, was viewed as this type of tyrant. He had to confiscate vehicles, tensions ran high, arguments occurred, that sort of thing. And it's a typical union scenario.
At the same time, Katie told investigators that her husband was involved in Project Children, an organization which brings children from Northern Ireland to the United States for summer vacations.
Here's a guy who travels to another country, to a hot spot in the world, a bed of terrorism, a bed of strife. Is this I think anyone with common sense would look into this and see if there's a connection here.
Well, the fact that he was executed in his own bed, most likely at night while he was sleeping, and no one seemed to have heard shots, led people to believe, geez, they might have used a silencer, that it was an execution. This could be as a result of his ties with the IRA, if he had ties.
The investigation took forensic scientists from the United States all the way to Northern Ireland. But the real evidence was right in Joe Doyle's backyard. Police investigating the murder of 39-year-old union official Joe Doyle pursued every possible lead, looking into his union activities over the past several years, as well as his involvement with a charity in Northern Ireland. Police couldn't identify anyone angry enough with Doyle to want him dead. So they looked once again at his wife, Katie, and her lover, George Lewis. Research into Katie's background found evidence of substance abuse and financial disagreements.
Joe was tough on Katie. Katie had a drug problem years before. Joe caught her. Joe didn't trust Katie anymore, didn't trust her with the money.
No relationship's perfect. This one certainly wasn't a perfect relationship. They're going to take a microscope and examine the spouse, their entire life, and they're going to try to dig up any piece of dirt possible.
Her boyfriend, George Lewis, had an alibi for the night of Joe Doyle's murder.
George basically was a real lover. He had other girlfriends besides Katie, apparently, and so he was out with one of his girlfriends that night.
Two people alibied him. The first one, which would be for the earlier part of the evening, was with the other woman with whom he was having an affair, and then for the later part of the evening was with his wife.
As for Katie Doyle, she said that she had sex with her husband that night and later left to sleep in an adjacent bedroom because of Joe's snoring. The door was shut and the air conditioner was running, and she claimed she never heard the shots.
The head of her bed would be resting against a wall. That wall is the same wall that separates her room from the bedroom where the victim is sleeping, which puts them in extremely close proximity to each other, a matter of feet.
The distance was 15 feet, separated by a 5-inch wall and a closet. Investigators brought in Dr. Harry Holeen, a forensic audio expert, to test Katie's claims. On a shooting range, Holeen fired a Makarov 9mm pistol and recorded the sounds.
When you fire a gun, you explode some gunpowder in a cartridge in a barrel, and that explosion is very rapid. So the acoustic signal coming out of the barrel as the bullet comes out of the barrel very rapidly, the acoustic signal also is one that's very abrupt.
The Makarov generated between 118 and 120 decibels of sound.
And it'd be comparable to a motorcycle, a heavy bus close by, power lawnmower, chainsaw, things such as that.
But the sound created by a gun is of short duration. Would Katie Doyle have heard it? To find out, Holeen used 2 adjacent bedrooms in his house. He then put the recording he had made of the Makarov pistol in one bedroom and a sound meter in the other bedroom. If the shot was 118 decibels, 60% of that sound, approximately 70 decibels, reached the other bedroom.
If you're asleep, there's a very good chance that it would wake you up.
And forensic scientists found another discrepancy in Katie's story. Katie said she left Joe's bedroom around midnight and that she found him dead at 6 a.m. But forensic scientists found alcohol in Joe's stomach. The alcohol he consumed at the club would all have been absorbed in his body had he been killed after midnight. The medical examiner estimated the time of death was closer to 10 p.m. This could easily explain why neighbors didn't hear the shots. The ambient sounds of televisions, radios, and stereos at that time of night could easily have muffled them. Next, investigators wanted to test Katie's nightgown that was found on the floor next to Joe's body. Pulling the trigger creates a small explosion when the primer ignites the gunpowder, which in turn propels the bullet. Gases from that explosion create a small cloud about 3 to 5 feet in diameter that usually wafts back over the shooter.
The gases from the primer escape from the firearm through any available opening. In the form of a gas or a vapor, it then solidifies into tiny particles which are deposited on the hands, clothing, or the immediate proximity of the discharge.
Using an aluminum disc with a permanent adhesive, scientist Skip Schwogel lifted samples from the surface of the nightgown. Next, he removed the stud from its plastic holder and placed it inside a scanning electron microscope. The particles are magnified and scanned to reveal their chemical makeup. On Katie Doyle's gown were thousands of particles, seen here magnified 4,000 times. They were made up of lead, antimony, and barium, the chemical components of gunpowder.
It's not natural in the environment. When those three particles are fused together, that's unique to gunshot residue.
Schwobel also found gunshot residue on the bedding next to the body.
Gunshot residue is going to get on the bed and on items on the bed. Katie said that before she left that room and went to the other room to go to sleep, she took her nightgown off, threw it on the bed. She doesn't recall where she threw it on the bed. It was dark.
With no gunshot residue on Katie's hands and gunshot residue on the bedding as well as her nightgown, prosecutors had no forensic evidence Katie Doyle fired the pistol. And without forensic evidence, prosecutors had plenty of suspicions, but very little proof. Police believe Katie Doyle lied when she told them her husband was alive when she left his bedroom around midnight. An analysis of his stomach contents put the murder closer to 10 p.m. According to their home phone records, someone called for Joe shortly after 10 p.m., and what Katie told the caller was revealing.
She said that the victim couldn't come to the phone because he was toast. In other words, he was intoxicated, and that's why he couldn't talk on the phone.
There was no gunshot residue on Katie's hands, but her nightgown found on the floor did test positive for gunshot residue, and so did the covers on the bed. So Skip Schwobel decided to analyze the nightgown to study the exact concentrations and placement of the residue.
Well, 20 years ago, when we didn't have the automated analysis by scanning electron microscope, a sample could take 12, 13 hours looking at it manually. Today, we're able to look at many thousands of particles in a short period of time.
Those tests revealed large amounts of residue on both the right and left front chest area, consistent with where a gun would be positioned. That was all the evidence police needed.
The significance of the gown is the reason why I arrested the victim's wife for the murder of her husband.
Prosecutors think they know the motive for the murder.
She was head over heels over this guy. She didn't want Joe anymore. I mean, this is your standard one spouse not wanting to be married.
The forensic evidence shows that Joe Doyle was in bed sometime before 10 p.m. Prosecutors believe Katie went into the bedroom, took her husband's 9mm pistol from the lockbox, then fired 4 shots into his head at close range. The invisible gunshot vapor drifted backwards towards her and settled on her nightgown. Katie took off her nightgown and threw it on the floor to show police the two had slept together. But it was proof of something else, proof that she had worn it while killing her husband. Katie had 7 or 8 hours to leave home and get rid of the pistol. The next morning, neighbors said Katie's car was in a different parking spot from where it was the night before. According to telephone records, Katie called her boyfriend 3 times on the night of the murder. Prosecutors don't believe the boyfriend was involved.
If she even acknowledged and admitted that she had gotten in touch with George that night. If he had any role in it, we have no proof of it.
Katie Doyle was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Her lawyer maintains Katie is innocent, but he has no idea who killed Joe Doyle.
Why are we looking at Kate? Because she's the wife, because the police don't want to get outside the house, because that's their mode of investigation. And they're stuck there. And they're stuck there to this day.
Investigators say science leaves no doubt about the killer's identity.
It's much harder to get away with a crime today than it was years ago. We have instrumentation, preparation techniques that are much more advanced now. We can do particle extractions from clothing, from hands, and it doesn't have to be specifically gunshot residue.
If it wouldn't have been, again, with the work that Skip Schwobel did with the microparticles that were found on the nightshirt that she had been wearing the night that this occurred, we probably would have never had enough information to make an arrest, let alone to get a conviction.
I'd rather rely on science in every case than on a human being. Science, especially when you can get different areas of science all pointing to the same suspect, is key to any prosecution.
Murder of a prominent businessman in Colorado was particularly difficult to solve since the killers left virtually no forensic evidence at the scene. But information gathered from a small-town diner, an endocrinologist, and a forensic botanist took a bite out of the chief suspect's alibi. At an elevator,
You could trust him with your life.
on October 22nd, 1993, Boggs didn't show up for work as he usually did. Jerry's brother went to his home and found him dead inside the back door. He had been shot to death. Nearby was a plastic bag and a bloody shovel.
So it appeared that he had been ambushed. Someone was hitting him in the head with a shovel, and far enough to hit the overhead beam.
Boggs often kept his doors unlocked, but there were no valuables missing. Investigators could find no foot impressions, foreign hairs, or fibers.
We didn't have any direct evidence. We didn't have any fingerprints, any DNA, anything that directly connected anyone to the crime scene.
A neighbor reported seeing two suspicious-looking men near Boggs' home on the day of the murder. And police had another suspect, Jerry Boggs' ex-wife, Jill Coit. The two got married when Jill became pregnant with Jerry's baby.
I don't think he was in love with her. I think that she tricked him and into getting married.
The marriage lasted for only 7 days. Jerry had the marriage annulled when he learned that Jill hadn't gotten a divorce from her previous husband.
I couldn't figure out what in the world he was doing with this woman because in 1 hour, I could tell that she was just off the wall. Absolutely the strangest person and not at all suited for Jerry.
After the annulment, the two barely spoke.
And she would come to Steamboat and she would call up people that Jerry knew, talk about the child and how Jerry had thrown them out and he was a horrible person.
When questioned, Jill said she had an alibi for the night of Jerry's murder. She said she was camping at the Poudre National Park 150 miles away. Her new boyfriend, Michael Backus, corroborated her alibi. Investigators were left to wonder who killed Jerry Boggs and why. The autopsy revealed that Jerry Boggs had been beaten with a shovel and shot 3 times in the chest with a .25 caliber pistol. Investigators closely analyzed the shovel for clues.
The shovel itself was very old. The wood was very porous. Our lab people concluded that whoever was using it was probably wearing gloves. So there were bloody hand prints on it, and you could see where fingers had been, but there was no ridge detail with which to make an identification.
In addition to the head injuries and bullet wounds, there were some other injuries that experts couldn't explain. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, methods that are crude and sometimes inaccurate, the medical examiner estimated that Boggs died sometime the night before his body was found. Police had two leads. A neighbor reported seeing two men near Boggs' home earlier in the afternoon on the day Boggs was killed. Boggs' ex-wife, Jill Coit, was also a suspect. She and Boggs had been fighting over a $100,000 loan Boggs made to Jill's bed and breakfast hotel during their brief marriage.
It was an embarrassment, too. You know, you live in a small town, you know all these people, you get married, you've never been married before, you get married, and all of a sudden, you've got this can of worms to deal with that was just so much. It was just horrible for him. I'm sure at times he probably just wanted to crawl under the rug.
Jill had an alibi for the night of the murder. Investigators wanted to make sure Boggs was killed at night and not earlier in the day. For a better estimate of the time of death, Dr. Doberson decided to analyze the undigested food in Boggs' stomach.
So if we could find out where he ate and at what time he ate, we could really narrow down the time of death.
In retracing Boggs' steps on the day of the murder, investigators learned that Jerry opened the hardware store at 10 o'clock as he did every morning. He worked for a while, then walked 2 doors down to the shack for breakfast. There he ordered the same meal he always did: eggs, toast, and hash brown potatoes.
Usual? Yes, indeed. The folks in the cafe said, oh yeah, he stopped by here and had his usual.
To see if breakfast was Boggs' last meal, investigators turned to scientists at the University of Colorado.
We've done the same thing with woolly mammoths frozen in the ice in Siberia and Alaska, identified what plants they were eating.
David Norris, an endocrinologist at the University of Colorado, and his colleague, forensic botanist Jane Bach, were asked to examine Boggs' stomach contents. Basically, humans consume between 50 and 75 different types of plants in their diet. Plants are easier to distinguish in the stomach than animal products.
The cell walls themselves remain intact, and they'll pass entirely through the digestive system. This makes identification quite easy. It doesn't make any difference whether the material was frozen, whether it was boiled, it will remain virtually indestructible.
Dr. Norris placed a sample of Boggs' stomach contents on a slide. Under his microscope, Dr. Norris saw a jumble of irregular hexagons. He recognized them as the intact cells of either potato or apple. Both had nearly identical cell structures. To determine which one, Dr. Norris used potassium iodide, a test for the presence of starch.
A drop of it is added to the material on the slide, and if starch is present, it will turn black.
Under a microscope, the cells turned black, which confirmed the presence of starch. The cells were from potatoes. Since Jerry ate hash browns on the day he was murdered, the presence of potatoes seemed to indicate breakfast was his last meal. Or was it?
In addition to the potato cells, I also saw cells of onions. And these are relatively easy to identify because of the brick-like shape of the cells and the way they're put together, kind of like looking at a brick wall.
The short-ordered cook at the diner insisted he never put onions in the eggs or the hash brown potatoes.
So we thought, well, this is a worry. Maybe he did have another later meal.
Another meal meant that Boggs was killed after dinner. The prime suspect, his ex-wife Jill Coit, had an airtight alibi for that night. The only other suspects were the two men seen near Boggs' home, whom police hadn't yet identified. mysterious murder of Jerry Boggs baffled police in the quiet resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Investigators found evidence that Boggs grew suspicious of his ex-wife after the annulment when he caught her lying about her date of birth. Boggs hired his friend, Judy Pryor Lewis, a private investigator, to look into Jill's background. And what she uncovered was shocking. She learned that Jill lied about her pregnancy with Jerry's baby. She hadn't been pregnant at all. She had a hysterectomy years earlier.
She claimed to have a child, and we were all telling him there is no child. It's all just a ruse. He still believed it. He just couldn't accept it. He would come down to our house, and I would just try everything I knew to convince him that there really was no baby.
Jill was a former model and beauty queen who had lied to Jerry about her background and the number of times she was married. Jill Lunita Billiot, Einan Moore Coit Brody, DeRosa Metzger Steely Boggs Carroll had been married nearly a dozen times.
I don't smoke or drink. I guess my greatest sin is that I get married.
Jill had married and divorced another man after Jerry and was about to walk down the aisle yet again to her new boyfriend, Michael Backus. And what was Boggs' reaction?
He started laughing. We just sat and laughed. He's like, oh my God.
What wasn't so funny was Jill's third husband, William Coit, had been murdered 20 years earlier with the same caliber weapon that killed Jerry Boggs. William Coit's murder was unsolved.
The circumstances were very similar in that both Jerry Boggs and William Coit were preparing to take her to court. They were within a week of a court date. They were within a week of a court date where her character was going to be exposed.
And Boggs' private investigator found evidence that Jill falsely claimed to be pregnant in other marriages, presumably for financial purposes.
Mr. Boggs, I think, was at the point of disclosing to the world many things about Jill Coit that she wanted to remain secret. And she had taken, I think, a very dramatic step to ensure that that did not occur.
She'd gotten away with so many things, and she was proud of it. That she's been married, 10 or 11 times, 6 bigamies out of that. All these kids she says that she's had, she hasn't, and she couldn't stand it.
Jill said she was camping in a state park on the night of Boggs' murder. But in order to completely eliminate her as a suspect, investigators needed to be sure Boggs was killed at night and not earlier in the day. Boggs' murder presumably happened at night after dinner, since onions were discovered in his stomach. The cooks at the shack insisted they didn't put onions in Boggs' breakfast on the morning of his death. One of Steamboat's homicide investigators decided to take a closer look.
Not to be deterred, he took himself down there and stood in the kitchen and watched them making breakfast one morning.
The cook prepared the same breakfast Jerry Boggs always ate. True to his word, the cook did not add onions to the hash browns he threw on the grill. But while watching the grill, homicide investigators saw a flurry of activity that suddenly explained everything. Every time the cook turned an omelet or scattered an order of hash browns, small portions of diced onions from other orders would get mixed in.
I believe he photographed the spatula that was used to flip the eggs, to grill the hash brown potatoes, and the edge of the spatula is covered with bits of onion.
You don't know when you're getting the food at the other end what's going on the grill.
Breakfast had, in fact, been Jerry Boggs' last meal.
We felt vindicated, we felt very good about that because we knew they were there.
Boggs was killed just a few hours after breakfast. Jill Coit did not have an alibi for the afternoon of Boggs' death. Still, the stomach contents yielded only circumstantial evidence.
We didn't have any direct evidence. We didn't have any fingerprints, any DNA, anything that directly connected anyone to the crime scene. We didn't have anything in the nature of a confession in connection with the case. We didn't have smoking gun type of evidence.
Armed with a search warrant, police searched Jill's car and found wigs, maps of Mexico, and a stun gun. Was it possible it was Jill Coit in disguise that the neighbors saw walking in the vicinity of Jerry's home on the afternoon of his murder? The weapon used in Jerry Boggs' murder, a .25 caliber pistol, was not found in Jill Coit's car. But investigators suspected the stun gun in her trunk may have caused the unusual marks on Boggs' face and neck, which were noted during the autopsy.
Stun gun injuries fall into a category of injuries called patterned injuries, which means the injuries mirror the object that caused them. So in the case of a stun gun injury, you will have electrical burns mimic the distance between the electrodes that caused them. The injuries lined up identically with the distance between the electrodes.
Pig skin most closely resembles human skin. So Dr. Doberson applied the stun gun to a live anesthetized pig to see if he could reproduce the round reddish marks on Jerry Boggs' neck and face. The marks were similar.
Interestingly enough, the animal has to be alive in order to show the characteristic injuries, which also means that Jerry Boggs was alive at the time that he sustained those injuries.
The forensic evidence was bringing the crime into focus. The witness who reported seeing two men near Jerry's home on the day of the murder said Jill Coit and her boyfriend Michael Backus resembled the men in height.
Jill liked to wear disguises and had a number of disguises. And eventually we even came up with a photograph that had been taken of her sometime prior to the homicide, where she was wearing a beard and a mustache.
And Jill's alibi disintegrated when police could find no evidence that she had signed in and paid the admission fee to Poudre National Park on the day of the murder. Jill Coit and Michael Backus were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the preliminary hearing, it appeared even Jill was impressed with the forensic evidence against her.
I remember presenting all of that in front of the judge, and she was there. At the end, I picked up all my materials and slides and walked out next to her, and she looked at me and said, "Nice job." And then I took that as quite a compliment.
And there was a surprise witness. Jill's son Seth testified against her.
Right after she and Bacchus had committed the murder, she telephoned Seth to let him know. I believe her words to him were something to the effect of, "It's over," and it was messy.
It did not appear to me that he really had participated in any meaningful way, that he had been a conspirator in connection with that. It appeared to me that he had been very little more than an unwilling person being provided information by somebody who was trying to get him to engage in activity.
Prosecutors believe that Michael Backus and Jill Coit, in disguise, entered Jerry's home in the early afternoon with the intent of murdering Boggs, presumably to end their financial dispute. After having his usual breakfast of eggs, toast, and hash browns, which had been unknowingly spiked with onions, Boggs left work early that day and arrived home sometime after 1 p.m. When he did, Jill and her boyfriend were waiting. Boggs was ambushed at the back door, first with a stun gun, then with the shovel. After a suffocation attempt failed, prosecutors believe it was Jill who shot Boggs 3 times with a .25 caliber pistol. The two were careful not to leave incriminating evidence, and their disguises were almost foolproof. But they never realized forensic science could identify the specific items in Boggs' stomach which destroyed their flimsy alibi. When news of the crime became public, Jill's oldest son, William, came forward with his suspicions that his mother had also killed his father, William Coit Sr., some 20 years earlier.
She's more like a praying mantis. She just devours them once she gets a hold of them.
It took the jury only 5 hours to find Jill Coit and Michael Backus guilty of first-degree murder.
I think she was more or less motivated on the money. I think she thought that would make her happy in life. And look where she is. So apparently money can't buy you everything, huh?
They were both sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole.
I believe that Jill Coit was aware that there are methods for determining time of death. I don't think she was aware that the stomach contents could be that telling.
It ultimately blew her alibi out of the water.
I think she was pretty clever. They were pretty clever in wearing, bringing along clothing or plastic bags or whatever they used to camouflage themselves from leaving forensic evidence. I mean, there were no prints, no hairs, nothing. And so they were very cautious about that, but she should have been watching some of your shows.
The first scream never reached the highway. It vanished into the endless Louisiana swamp, swallowed by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, carried away by slow black water that had hidden secrets long before the first paved road crossed the parish. By sunrise, nothing remained except silence, a lonely dirt path, and a faint impression of tire tracks already disappearing beneath another humid summer morning. People still argue about what happened that night. Some insist evil arrived in a pickup truck with its headlights turned off. Others believe the killer had been waiting long before the victim ever appeared. No one can prove either story. What everyone agrees on is this. On August 18th, 1981, a young schoolteacher named Rebecca Landry disappeared less than 15 minutes from home. She was 27. She knew every family in town. She taught third grade. She never missed church on Sunday. She never ignored her mother's evening phone call. She never vanished without a word. Until that Tuesday. Rebecca left the elementary school shortly after 6 in the evening. Several teachers remembered watching her lock the classroom door. One joked that she spent more time decorating bulletin boards than anyone in the district. Another remembered her carrying a cardboard box filled with student drawings. She smiled before climbing into her pale blue sedan. That smile would become the last confirmed sighting anyone could agree upon. At 7:30, her mother waited for dinner. At 8, she called Rebecca's apartment. No answer. At 9, neighbors were asked if they had seen her. Nobody had. By midnight, deputies were driving slow circles along narrow parish roads illuminated by flashing blue lights reflecting across stagnant water. The missing person report was filed before dawn. At first, investigators assumed there had been an accident. Louisiana roads in summer could become deadly without warning. Rain turned gravel into mud. Drainage canals stretched beside highways like invisible traps. A single mistake behind the wheel could send a vehicle beneath dark water where nobody would notice for days. Search crews checked every canal. Nothing. Helicopters circled miles of marshland. Nothing. Divers searched ponds. Nothing. Rebecca and her car had simply disappeared. Within 48 hours, the town transformed. Church bulletin boards displayed photographs. Gas stations taped missing posters beside lottery advertisements. Local radio interrupted music every hour with updates. The grocery store became a place where whispers replaced conversation. Everyone knew Rebecca. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone suspected someone else. Then came the first crack in the mystery. A farmer reported seeing tire marks leading toward an abandoned logging road several miles outside town. Deputies followed the trail. The road ended beside an isolated clearing surrounded by dense trees. There they found broken glass, a single pearl earring, and fresh signs of a violent struggle. The earth looked as though several people had fought desperately before someone dragged a heavy object toward the woods. There was blood. Not much, just enough to convince investigators that Rebecca had not simply driven away. Crime scene technicians photographed every inch. The area was sealed. Search dogs arrived before noon. The dogs followed a scent nearly 400 yards before stopping abruptly beside the edge of the swamp. The trail ended there. No footprints continued beyond. No clothing. No body. Nothing. It felt impossible. Experienced detectives stood in silence, staring across motionless water. One deputy reportedly whispered something nobody forgot. The swamp didn't take her. If it had, it would have left something behind. That sentence haunted the investigation for decades. Because he was right. The swamp always returned something. A shoe. A wallet. Bones. Metal. Fabric. Eventually. But not Rebecca. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The investigation exploded across Louisiana newspapers. Headlines screamed, "Local teacher vanishes without trace." Mystery deepens in rural parish. Family begs for answers. Tips flooded into the sheriff's office. A truck seen near the school. A stranger buying gasoline. An argument outside a diner. Every lead sounded promising. Every lead collapsed. Detectives interviewed more than 200 people before autumn. Friends. Former classmates. Neighbors. Students' parents. Hunters. Travelers. Anyone who might have seen something. Nobody admitted knowing why Rebecca disappeared. Yet one detail continued resurfacing. A dark pickup truck. Different witnesses described different years. Different colors. Different license plates. But they all remembered seeing a pickup near Rebecca, sometime during the final week before she vanished. It was enough to attract attention. Not enough to make an arrest. Investigators expanded the search. Vehicle registrations, employment records, military veterans, seasonal workers, oil field contractors. Thousands of documents piled across folding tables inside the sheriff's office. Nothing connected. Meanwhile, Rebecca's apartment revealed its own unsettling story. Her purse remained inside. Bills waited unpaid. Laundry sat folded neatly on the couch. Food spoiled quietly in the refrigerator. Nothing suggested someone planning to disappear. Nothing suggested a secret life. Friends described Rebecca as careful, predictable, kind. She loved mystery novels but disliked surprises. She planned lessons weeks ahead. She kept handwritten calendars. She saved birthday cards. She rarely traveled farther than Baton Rouge. The idea that she had abandoned everything voluntarily made no sense. Then investigators noticed something missing. A small silver camera. Rebecca carried it almost everywhere. Students remembered her photographing classroom projects. Friends remembered weekend picnics, family vacations, birthday parties. The camera had vanished. No photographs were ever recovered. The possibility chilled detectives. What if Rebecca had unknowingly photographed someone? Someone dangerous. Someone who realized too late they had been seen. The theory spread quickly. It also died quickly. Without the camera, there was no proof. Without proof, there was only imagination. Months later, another development shook the investigation. Hunters discovered Rebecca's abandoned sedan hidden beneath thick brush nearly 20 miles from the original crime scene. Someone had deliberately concealed it. Branches covered the roof. Mud coated the tires. The license plate had been removed. Inside, detectives found dried blood, several unidentified fingerprints, one broken watch, and Rebecca's classroom keys. For the first time, investigators believed they were finally close. The vehicle became the center of an enormous forensic examination. In 1981, technology had limits. Fingerprint comparisons depended largely on human eyes. Technicians lifted every print they could find. Some belonged to Rebecca. Some belonged to mechanics. One belonged to an investigating deputy. Several remained unidentified. One fingerprint in particular stood apart, perfectly preserved. Clear ridge detail. Left index finger. Found on the inside edge of the driver's door. Detectives believed it might belong to the killer. They searched local records. No match. State records. No match. Federal records. No match. The print entered storage. A tiny square of evidence sealed inside an envelope, almost forgotten. Almost. Investigators turned back toward interviews. Pressure mounted. Television crews arrived. The sheriff promised progress. Citizens demanded arrests. Rumors spread faster than facts. One local mechanic became the prime suspect after claiming he repaired Rebecca's car weeks earlier. His fingerprints matched several found under the hood. He failed a polygraph. Newspapers practically declared him guilty, but evidence refused to cooperate. His fingerprints did not match the mysterious print inside the driver's door. His timeline checked out. He was released. Another suspect emerged, a drifter passing through town. Witnesses claimed he resembled a composite sketch. Detectives tracked him across 3 states. He confessed, then admitted he confessed only because he believed cooperation would shorten his jail sentence on unrelated charges. The confession collapsed. Months disappeared. The file grew heavier. Boxes multiplied. Maps covered walls. Coffee cups stained reports. Marriages strained under endless overtime. Veteran detectives retired without answers. New investigators inherited shelves filled with frustration. Every few years, someone reopened the case. Every few years, another promising lead evaporated. The evidence remained. Blood samples. Photographs. The unidentified fingerprint. Boxes labeled simply Landry. Cold case. As the years passed, children who once sat in Rebecca's classroom became adults with children of their own. Some barely remembered her face. Others remembered only the fear that settled over town after sunset. Parents stopped allowing children to ride bicycles alone. Businesses closed earlier. Women avoided isolated roads. Every unfamiliar truck attracted suspicious looks. The disappearance became more than an investigation. It became a warning passed from one generation to the next. Don't stop for strangers. Don't drive alone at night. Don't trust quiet roads. Because Rebecca did. And she never came home. The sheriff who first handled the case died believing the truth had slipped through his fingers. At his funeral, retired deputies quietly discussed the investigation one last time. One of them reportedly repeated the same sentence spoken beside the swamp decades earlier. The swamp didn't take her. Someone else did. Nobody realized that, tucked away inside climate-controlled evidence storage, the single fingerprint collected from the driver's door had survived every flood, every office relocation, every budget cut, every retirement, and every passing year. It waited without changing, silent, patient, untouched. And somewhere beyond Louisiana, a man who had lived an ordinary life for more than 40 years believed one careless touch on a hot August night had disappeared forever. He believed time had erased every mistake. He believed every witness had either forgotten, moved away, or died. He was wrong. Because evidence never grows old. It only waits for someone willing to look again. This is a fictional crime story. The fingerprint sat inside a yellowing evidence envelope, while the world outside changed beyond recognition. Computers replaced filing cabinets. Cassette tapes became forgotten relics. Detectives who had once stood beneath the scorching Louisiana sun with notebooks and Polaroid cameras slowly disappeared into retirement, carrying unanswered questions that refused to fade. Yet the single print remained exactly as it had been on the day it was lifted from the driver's door. Sharp, complete, waiting. Inside the sheriff's office, the Landry file became something almost mythical. New deputies heard about it before they ever saw it. Veteran investigators spoke of it in lowered voices, as if the case itself carried a curse. Every detective believed he might be the one to solve it. Every detective eventually walked away frustrated. Boxes of reports filled an entire storage room. Thousands of interviews. Hundreds of photographs. Dozens of suspects. Not one arrest. Every few years, another investigator reopened the file, convinced fresh eyes will reveal something everyone else had overlooked. Every reopening followed the same pattern. Excitement, long nights, coffee-stained reports, hope, then silence. The evidence never changed. Neither did the fingerprint. By the early 1990s, forensic science was advancing faster than anyone expected. DNA analysis was transforming investigations across the country. Fingerprint databases were becoming digital instead of paper archives. Detectives in Louisiana quietly wondered whether Rebecca's case might finally benefit from technology that simply had not existed in 1981. The evidence was unpacked again. Every item was photographed once more. The blood samples were preserved. Fibers were cataloged. The mysterious fingerprint was scanned into a new computer system. The machine searched. Minutes became hours. Nothing. No match. The result felt almost cruel. One detective slammed the file shut. "Either our man has never been arrested," he muttered, "or he's been dead for years." The room fell silent. Nobody answered, because both possibilities sounded equally hopeless. Meanwhile, outside the investigation, life continued. Rebecca's parents grew older. Her mother never removed the porch light. Every evening, just before sunset, she walked to the front door and switched it on. Neighbors offered to replace the bulb. Whenever it burned out, she always refused. She insisted on doing it herself. "It's for Rebecca," she would quietly say. The ritual continued for decades. Children who had not even been born in 1981 grew up asking why the light never went off. Their parents answered with the same sentence. Someone never came home. The disappearance had become part of the town's identity. Every anniversary brought newspaper articles. Old photographs appeared on television. Reporters repeated familiar phrases. Cold case. Missing teacher. Unanswered mystery. Communities still waiting. The headlines changed very little. The pain never changed at all. Then came an unexpected discovery. Not evidence. Not DNA. Not a confession. A notebook. It belonged to Detective Harold Mercer, one of the original investigators. After his death, his family donated several boxes of old police documents to the sheriff's archive. Most contained duplicate reports already stored in the official file. One notebook did not. Its pages were filled with handwritten observations, small details, personal impressions, things too uncertain to include in official reports. One sentence caught everyone's attention. Woman at Miller's grocery looked terrified during interview. Refused to speak after noticing blue pickup across the street. There was no follow-up, no additional report, no explanation. Investigators searched the original files. Nothing. No second interview. No recorded statement. It was as though the observation had simply vanished from the investigation. The grocery store no longer existed. The owner had died years earlier. Employees had scattered across different states. Finding the unidentified woman seemed almost impossible. Still, detectives tried. Old payroll records, tax documents, photographs from local newspapers, church directories, yearbooks, anything that might identify the frightened witness Mercer had mentioned only once. Months passed. Finally, an elderly librarian recognized one face in a faded newspaper clipping. Her name was Eleanor Batiste. She had worked as a cashier in 1981. According to public records, she now lived nearly 300 miles away in a quiet coastal town. Detectives drove there without announcing their visit. They expected another dead end. Instead, they found an 80-year-old woman watering flowers on her porch. She recognized the badge immediately. Her expression changed before a single question was asked. "You finally came back," she whispered. Those 4 words froze everyone standing there. Inside her modest living room, Eleanor stared at an old photograph resting on the coffee table. It showed her husband, long deceased. She folded her hands, looked toward the window, then shook her head. I've been waiting a long time. The detectives exchanged glances. One switched on a recorder. Another opened a notebook. No one interrupted. For nearly a minute, Eleanor said nothing. Only the ticking of an old clock filled the room. Finally, she spoke. I saw someone. The sentence landed like thunder. She explained that on the afternoon Rebecca disappeared, a man entered the grocery store shortly before closing. He purchased bottled water, cigarettes, and duct tape. Nothing unusual, except he kept watching Rebecca through the front window while she fueled her car across the street. He wasn't shopping, Eleanor said quietly. He was waiting. She remembered his eyes. Cold. Patient. Never leaving Rebecca. Detectives leaned forward. Why didn't you tell investigators? Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. I tried. According to her account, she had arrived at the sheriff's office the following morning intending to give a statement. Before she entered, she noticed the same blue pickup parked across the street. The same man sat behind the wheel, watching. Not the police station, watching her. She panicked. She left. That evening someone called her home. The voice never identified itself. Only one sentence. Forget what you saw. Then the line went dead. Eleanor never contacted police again. Weeks later she married, moved away, spent 40 years convincing herself silence was safer than truth. Until now. Detectives listened without speaking. Every word sounded unbelievable. Yet none of it contradicted the known timeline. Even more unsettling, Mercer had apparently believed her fear was genuine. His notebook proved she had existed, that she had almost spoken, that something or someone had stopped her. The investigation changed overnight. Artists worked with Eleanor to create a new composite sketch. She apologized repeatedly. I only saw him for a minute. But memory, strange as it is, sometimes preserves faces while forgetting everything else. The sketch spread across television stations and newspapers. Calls flooded the tip line. Most were useless. Some bordered on fantasy. Every caller seemed convinced they recognized the face. No evidence supported their certainty. Then one retired truck mechanic called. His voice trembled. I knew a man who looked like that. He described a quiet laborer who drifted between construction jobs during the early 1980s. The man rarely spoke about his past. He avoided photographs. He left town without warning after only a few months. No forwarding address. No family. Only a first name. Daniel. Nothing else. Investigators searched employment records, union records, old motel registrations, driver's licenses. The trail dissolved almost immediately. Daniel could have been anyone, or no one. Still, one detail refused to disappear. The blue pickup. Again. Always the blue pickup. It had haunted the investigation from the first week. Witness after witness remembered it. Different years, different descriptions, but always blue, always near Rebecca, always gone before police arrived. Detectives returned to Mercer's notebook. On the final page, beneath hurried handwriting nearly impossible to read, another sentence emerged after digital enhancement. Someone knows. They're afraid. No names. No explanation. Just those 4 words. Someone knows. They're afraid. For the first time in decades, investigators no longer believe the case had gone cold because evidence disappeared. They believe it had gone cold because fear had spread faster than the truth. And somewhere, hidden beneath 40 years of ordinary life, the owner of that fingerprint was still counting on that fear to protect him. He had no idea that one frightened witness had finally decided silence was a heavier burden than memory, and that a forgotten notebook had just reopened the door he believed had been sealed forever. This is a fictional crime story. Fear has a way of surviving longer than memory. Names disappear. Faces blur. Buildings collapse. Roads are widened. Families move away. But fear remains almost untouched, quietly passing from one generation to the next without anyone realizing where it began. That realization changed everything. Detectives stopped asking who might have killed Rebecca Landry. Instead, they asked a different question. Who had spent 40 years making sure nobody talked? The difference seemed small. It changed the entire investigation. Boxes that had remained sealed for decades were opened again. Every witness interview was read line by line. Investigators no longer searched only for contradictions. They searched for hesitation, for missing pages, for interviews that ended too quickly, for people who suddenly refused follow-up meetings. A pattern slowly emerged. Several witnesses had withdrawn their statements within days of speaking to police. At the time, detectives blamed fading memories. Now the withdrawals looked different. One fisherman insisted he had seen Rebecca's sedan parked near the old logging road on the afternoon she vanished. 2 days later, he claimed he had mistaken the vehicle for another car. A waitress remembered serving Rebecca coffee with an unfamiliar man only hours before the disappearance. 3 days later, she declared she had confused Rebecca with another customer. A teenage hunter reported hearing what sounded like a woman screaming somewhere beyond the swamp shortly after sunset. His father arrived at the sheriff's office the next morning. The statement was withdrawn. No explanation. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it felt impossible to ignore. Someone had frightened people into silence. The question was how. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks, newly assigned to the cold case unit, covered an entire conference room wall with photographs connected by colored strings. Red represented confirmed facts. Yellow represented uncertain observations. Blue marked rumors supported by more than one witness. The blue lines multiplied. Always the same vehicle. Always the same isolated roads. Always witnesses changing their stories. Brooks stepped backward. There was only one conclusion. Whoever committed the crime had not disappeared immediately afterward. He had remained close enough to watch the investigation unfold. Close enough to know who was talking. Close enough to frighten them. That possibility sent a chill through the entire task force. It meant the killer had walked the same grocery aisles as everyone else, filled gasoline beside them, sat in church, attended local festivals, smiled, shaken hands, perhaps even attended Rebecca's memorial service. The thought became impossible to ignore. Detectives returned to Eleanor Batiste. This time they brought old photographs collected from county archives, school events, parades, volunteer fire department picnics, newspaper clippings, company barbecues, hundreds of faces. One by one, Eleanor studied every image patiently. Hours passed. Nothing. Then her fingers stopped. She leaned closer. Her breathing changed. I know him. The room froze. The photograph had been taken during a parish fair in late summer 1981. Children crowded around a Ferris wheel. Families laughed beneath colorful lights. Near the edge of the picture stood a man wearing a baseball cap and denim jacket. His face appeared only partially visible, blurry, barely recognizable. But Eleanor never looked at his face. She pointed toward the truck parked behind him, blue. Exactly the same shade she remembered. He drove that. The image was immediately sent for enhancement. Specialists sharpened every available detail. The license plate remained unreadable. The man's face improved slightly, enough to estimate his age. Mid-30s. Dark hair. Clean-shaven. Average height. Nothing remarkable. Ordinary. That frightened investigators more than anything. Monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like everyone else. The enhanced image circulated quietly among retired deputies. One deputy stared at it for nearly 5 minutes. Finally he spoke. I've seen him before. He could not remember where. Only that the face felt familiar. Construction site? Gas station? Volunteer rescue team? He wasn't sure. Memory refused to cooperate. Still, detectives kept digging. Employment records from 1981 revealed dozens of temporary workers passing through the parish during the summer. Oil crews, bridge contractors, telephone line installers, logging companies. One company attracted immediate attention, Bayou Gulf Construction. The firm had employed more than 70 temporary laborers that season. Personnel files had long since disappeared after the business declared bankruptcy. Only payroll summaries survived. Many employees listed incomplete addresses. Some used post office boxes. Several had only first initials. Tracking them became a nightmare. Weeks turned into months. One investigator joked that they were chasing ghosts. Nobody laughed. Then another coincidence appeared. A mechanic restoring an abandoned warehouse discovered an old maintenance ledger tucked inside a rusted filing cabinet. Most pages documented vehicle repairs, oil changes, tire replacements, routine inspections. One entry stood apart. August 16, 1981. Blue Ford pickup. Driver requested replacement driver's side window. Reason listed simply as broken glass. The repair occurred 2 days before Rebecca disappeared. Detectives requested the original work order. Gone. Payment records. Gone. Customer signature. Gone. Only the ledger remained. Still, it was something. The truck had existed. It had been damaged. Someone wanted it repaired immediately. Investigators examined crime scene photographs once more. Broken glass had been recovered from the logging road. Had it come from Rebecca's car or the pickup? In 1981, the fragments could not be matched. Modern forensic comparison offered new possibilities. Technicians unpacked carefully labeled evidence bags. Tiny glass fragments still remained. Under powerful microscopes, analysts compared thickness, chemical composition, and manufacturing characteristics. Days later, the report arrived. The broken glass from the crime scene did not belong to Rebecca's sedan. Silence filled the laboratory. If the report was correct, another vehicle had been damaged during the struggle, possibly the blue pickup, possibly while Rebecca fought for her life. The investigation gained momentum unlike anything seen in decades. Reporters sensed movement. Headlines returned. New forensic test reignites Louisiana cold case. Detectives re-examine decades OLD evidence. Forgotten witness prompts major breakthrough. Public attention exploded. So did anonymous tips. Some helpful, many absurd. One caller insisted Rebecca had been abducted by organized criminals. Another blamed a traveling carnival. A self-proclaimed psychic mailed 27 handwritten letters. Detectives ignored the noise. Facts mattered. Only facts. Then late one Thursday evening, the evidence room supervisor made an unexpected phone call. Another item from Rebecca's car had been digitally rescanned using equipment unavailable only a few years earlier. The broken wristwatch recovered from the driver's seat. Investigators had always assumed it belonged to Rebecca. It did not. The watch was a men's model. Cheap, mass-produced. The cracked crystal concealed something almost invisible. A smear, not dirt, not oil, dried blood. The amount was microscopic. Far too little for testing in 1981. Enough for modern laboratories. The sample was packaged under strict chain of custody procedures and sent for advanced analysis. No one celebrated. They had experienced too many disappointments. But deep inside the task force, hope quietly returned. For the first time, the investigation was no longer relying on fading memories. Evidence was beginning to speak again. And evidence, unlike witnesses, never became afraid. Somewhere, an aging man woke each morning believing history had buried his worst secret forever. He believed 45 summers had washed away every footprint, every stain, every careless mistake. He believed the forgotten witness had carried her silence to the grave. He did not know she had finally spoken. He did not know detectives were rebuilding a trail that had once seemed impossible to follow. And he had no idea that a single drop of blood, trapped beneath the cracked face of an inexpensive wristwatch since the humid summer of 1981, had just begun counting down the final days of the life he had spent decades pretending was ordinary. This is a fictional crime story. The blood sample was smaller than a grain of sand. A tiny trace hidden beneath a broken watch crystal. Something investigators in 1981 could barely see, let alone understand. For more than 40 years, it had remained locked inside an evidence bag, surrounded by thousands of forgotten pieces, a mystery that refused to die. Now, under the cold white lights of a modern forensic laboratory, that tiny piece of history was about to reveal whether Rebecca Landry's final moments had been trapped inside that abandoned vehicle. The analysts worked carefully. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Cold cases were fragile. One mistake could destroy the only remaining connection between the past and the truth. The sample was processed. The first results arrived 3 days later. Human blood. Male. Unknown origin. The room went silent. It was not Rebecca's blood. That single discovery changed the direction of the entire investigation. For decades, detectives had searched for a missing teacher. Now, they were searching for the man who left his blood behind. A killer who had walked away from the scene carrying a wound caused by a struggle that Rebecca had fought. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks stared at the report for several minutes. 40 years. 40 years of empty leads. 40 years of unanswered questions. And suddenly the case had something it had never had before, a biological connection. But there was a problem. The DNA profile had no match. The national database returned nothing. The state database returned nothing. The suspect had never been arrested, or he had never been caught. Either way, investigators were facing the same wall that had stopped them decades earlier. A person without a name. A fingerprint without an identity. A truck without a license plate. A witness with only a memory. But this time, the wall was beginning to crack. Detectives returned a mysterious fingerprint found inside Rebecca's car. The same fingerprint that had survived every year since 1981. The print had always been considered important, but now it became something more. A possible bridge between two pieces of evidence. The unknown fingerprint. The unknown male DNA. Two silent messages left behind by the same person. Forensic experts compared the location of the evidence. The fingerprint was found on the inside edge of the driver's door. The blood was discovered on the broken watch located near the driver's seat. Investigators recreated the possible sequence. Someone entered the vehicle. Someone struggled. Someone touched the door. Someone was injured. Someone left in a hurry. The crime scene was no longer a collection of random objects. It was becoming a timeline. And timelines reveal mistakes. The detectives studied the original crime photographs again. Every image was enlarged. Every shadow examined. Every reflection analyzed. Then an investigator noticed something hidden in the background of one photograph. A small piece of fabric caught on a broken tree branch near the logging road. In 1981, nobody considered it important. The photograph showed only a blurry piece of material. But modern enhancement revealed something unexpected. A pattern. Dark blue, with a thin white stripe, exactly like the work jackets worn by employees of Bayou Gulf Construction, the same company that had employed temporary workers around the time Rebecca disappeared. The same company connected to the damaged blue pickup. The same company whose records had mysteriously vanished. The investigation moved again. Former employees were located. Most were elderly. Some refused interviews. Some remembered nothing. But one former supervisor named Thomas Bell agreed to speak. He had managed equipment crews in 1981. When detectives mentioned Rebecca's name, his expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. "You never forgot her," Brooks said. Bell looked down. "No." "Why?" The old man took a long breath. "Because everyone thought she was gone." The detectives waited. Bell revealed something never included in the original investigation. 3 days after Rebecca disappeared, one worker failed to return to the construction site. His name was Daniel Voss. He was 29 years old, temporary employee, quiet, kept to himself, always drove a blue Ford pickup. Bell remembered that Voss had injured his hand around the same time. When asked how, Voss claimed he cut himself repairing equipment. Nobody questioned it. Then, 2 weeks later, he quit. No goodbye. No explanation. He collected his final paycheck and disappeared. The name hit investigators like a sudden shock. Daniel Voss. The possible owner of the blue pickup. The possible owner of the damaged window. The possible source of the blood. But there was still one problem. No photograph. No current address. No confirmed identity. Just another name buried in a forgotten file. The search began immediately. Old employment records, tax databases, property records, marriage licenses, death certificates. The investigators followed every possible path. They discovered Daniel Voss had moved several times after leaving Louisiana, first to Texas, then Arkansas, then Mississippi, always changing jobs, always avoiding attention. But there was something strange. He never used social media, never appeared in newspapers, never joined community organizations. He existed on paper, but barely, like a man determined to leave as few footprints as possible. Then came another discovery. In 1998, Daniel Voss had been questioned during a minor theft investigation in another state. He was never charged, but his fingerprints had been collected. Investigators froze. The file was requested. The fingerprint database searched. Everyone waited. The result appeared on the screen. A match. The fingerprint from Rebecca Landry's car belonged to Daniel Voss. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The impossible had happened. A fingerprint collected in 1981 had finally found its owner. The case that had haunted Louisiana for decades suddenly had a name, a suspect, a direction. But investigators knew something important. A fingerprint was not a conviction. They still needed the entire story. They needed to know what happened on that August night. They needed Rebecca. They needed the truth. Because Daniel Voss had disappeared from Louisiana. And if he had spent 40 years running from one secret, detectives needed to know where that secret had followed him. The search led them to a small rural town hundreds of miles away. A place where nobody knew the name Rebecca Landry. A place where Daniel Voss had built a quiet life. Neighbors described him as polite, private, helpful, the kind of person who fixed broken fences and carried groceries for elderly residents. Nobody believed the man living beside them could be connected to a decades-old disappearance. When investigators arrived at his home, they did not find a monster. They found an ordinary house, a clean yard, family photographs, a workshop, a normal life. That was what made it terrifying. Because sometimes the most frightening secrets are not hidden in dark places. They are hidden behind ordinary doors. Daniel Voss was not home, but someone else was, his wife. She opened the door. The moment detectives said his name, her face changed, not confusion. Fear. The same fear Eleanor Batiste had carried for decades. The same fear that appeared in witness statements buried inside old files. The investigators noticed. She knew something. The question was what? For 40 years, Daniel Voss had lived believing the past was gone. But the past had finally found his front door. And standing on the other side of that door was a woman who had spent decades protecting a secret she never wanted to know. This is a fictional crime story. The woman standing behind the door did not look like someone protecting a killer. She looked like someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. For several seconds, nobody moved. The detective stood on the front porch. The woman stared at the badges, the name on the paperwork, the photographs in their hands. Then her eyes dropped. She already knew why they were there. Her name was Claire Voss, Daniel Voss's wife for 36 years. She had spent more than half her life living beside a man who had carefully buried every trace of his past. Or so she believed. When Detective Brooks asked if Daniel was home, Claire hesitated, a hesitation lasting only a few seconds. But investigators noticed everything. In a cold case, tiny reactions become evidence. A nervous glance, a trembling hand, a door closed too quickly, a person who already knows the question before it is asked. Claire stepped outside and quietly shut the door behind her. He's at work. Where? She gave the answer. But she did not ask why they needed him. That was the first thing that convinced detectives she knew something. Most people would ask. Most people would be confused. Most people would want an explanation. Claire only looked tired, as if a moment she had feared for decades had finally arrived. The detectives did not arrest Daniel Voss that day. They did not have enough. They had a fingerprint. They had DNA evidence. They had a witness connecting him to the blue pickup. But they needed more. They needed to understand what happened. They needed to know whether Claire had been protecting him, or whether she had been trapped by the same fear that silenced everyone else. The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. At first, Claire answered only basic questions. Yes, she knew Daniel. Yes, they had been married since 1986. Yes, he had lived in Louisiana before moving away. No, she had never heard of Rebecca Landry. Then the detectives placed a photograph on the table. A photograph from 1981. Daniel Voss. Younger. Different. But recognizable. Claire stared at it. Her face changed. I knew it. The room became silent. Detective Brooks leaned forward. What did you know? Claire looked toward the window. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered that someday someone would come looking. She explained that when she first met Daniel, he never talked about Louisiana, never mentioned his childhood, never discussed old friends, never showed family photographs. At first, she considered him private. Some people simply avoided the past. But years later, she began noticing strange things. Daniel hated police sirens. He became tense whenever television programs mentioned missing persons. He refused to drive near certain rural areas. And every August around the same week, his mood changed. He became quiet, angry, distant. She had asked him once, why that week? Why every year? His answer was simple. Some memories don't disappear. She believed him. But she did not know what memory he meant. Until 1994. That was the year everything changed. A television report mentioned Rebecca Landry's disappearance during an anniversary story about unsolved cases. Daniel was sitting in the living room. The moment Rebecca's photograph appeared on the screen, he dropped the glass in his hand. Claire remembered the sound, the glass breaking, the silence afterward. She asked him what was wrong. Daniel said nothing. He simply turned off the television. That night, he packed a bag. He left for 3 days. When he returned, he acted as though nothing happened. Claire never forgot. She never stopped wondering. But she was afraid to ask again. Then came the moment that finally broke her. A few months before investigators arrived, Daniel began receiving strange phone calls. Nobody spoke. The caller would remain silent for several seconds, then hang up. Claire noticed Daniel becoming nervous. She asked who was calling. He answered, someone who remembers. That sentence stayed with her, because she realized something. Daniel was not afraid of someone finding him. He was afraid someone already knew. Investigators immediately requested phone records. They found several anonymous calls, but the numbers were blocked. No identity. No location. Another dead end. Except now the dead end had a direction. Someone else knew the truth. Someone else had been watching. The investigation expanded. Detectives searched Daniel Voss's history. They discovered he had maintained contact with almost nobody from Louisiana, except one person, a former construction worker named Raymond Cole. The name appeared only once. A bank transfer from 1989, then again in 2007. Small amounts. No explanation. Investigators located Raymond. He was living alone in northern Louisiana. When detectives mentioned Daniel's name, Raymond immediately ended the conversation. He refused to answer questions. He refused an interview. He refused even to acknowledge knowing him. That reaction raised suspicion. A man who knows nothing usually says nothing. A man hiding something often says, "Too much." Investigators returned with a warrant. Inside Raymond's storage unit, they discovered boxes filled with old construction documents. Among them, a photograph. Two men beside a blue pickup truck. One was Raymond. The other was Daniel Voss. The photo was dated July 1981, 1 month before Rebecca disappeared. Behind the photograph was handwriting. 3 words. Don't forget her. Nobody knew who wrote it. Nobody knew when. But investigators knew one thing. Daniel Voss had not acted alone. The investigation that had once focused on one man suddenly expanded. Another possible suspect. Another possible witness. Another person who had carried the secret for decades. The detectives returned to Claire. They asked the question she had been avoiding. Did Daniel ever tell you what happened? She looked down, then slowly shook her head. No. A pause. Then, but I think he wanted to. She explained that years earlier, Daniel had come home late one night after drinking. He sat alone in the garage for hours. When Claire found him, he was holding an old newspaper clipping, a missing person article, Rebecca Landry. He was crying, not angry, not afraid, crying. She asked what happened. Daniel looked at her and said, "I was there." Those 3 words haunted Claire, because Daniel never explained. He never confessed. He never denied. He simply destroyed the newspaper and refused to speak about it again. Investigators now had something more powerful than evidence. They had a pattern. A man connected to the victim, a hidden witness, a frightened wife, a second person refusing cooperation, and a secret that had survived for decades. But the biggest question remained unanswered. What happened after Rebecca Landry disappeared? Where was she taken? Why was her body never found? And why had Daniel Voss carried a memory of that night like a punishment instead of a victory? The detectives knew they were close. Closer than anyone had ever been. But they also knew something else. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous the investigation became. Because whoever had protected the secret since 1981 had spent decades making sure it stayed buried. And now the grave was beginning to open. This is a fictional crime story. The search for answers had finally moved beyond Rebecca Landry's disappearance. For 40 years, investigators had been chasing a shadow, a missing woman, an abandoned vehicle, a fingerprint with no name, a witness who was too afraid to speak. But now the shadow had a face. Daniel Voss. And for the first time since 1981, detectives were no longer asking whether someone was responsible. They were asking how many people had helped hide the truth. The photograph found inside Raymond Cole's storage unit became the center of the investigation. 2 men. 1 truck. 1 summer. 1 month before Rebecca vanished. The blue pickup sat behind them like a silent witness. Investigators enlarged the image until every detail was visible. The truck's body, the damaged driver's side window, the tools in the back, the clothing, the faces. Daniel Voss looked relaxed. Raymond Cole looked relaxed. 2 men standing beside a vehicle that would become connected to one of Louisiana's most haunting mysteries. At first glance, it was just a photograph. Detectives noticed something unusual. Daniel's left hand was wrapped in a bandage, the same hand that, according to the old employment records, had supposedly been injured while repairing equipment, the same time period as Rebecca's disappearance, the same injury that had never been properly investigated. A coincidence? Maybe. But after 40 years, investigators knew better than to ignore coincidences. They returned to the original evidence. The male DNA from the broken wristwatch, the fingerprint from the driver's door, the glass fragments from the logging road. Every piece pointed toward the same possibility. Daniel Voss had been there, but proving presence was not proving guilt. A person could leave a fingerprint without committing a crime. A person could bleed somewhere without being responsible. The detectives needed the missing piece. Rebecca. They needed to know where she went. The search for her final resting place began again. Thousands of acres of Louisiana wilderness were reviewed using modern mapping technology. Areas that had been impossible to search in 1981 were examined digitally. Old satellite images were compared with new ones. Changes in land, new roads, collapsed structures, hidden locations. Investigators focused on the abandoned logging area where Rebecca's car had been found. They believed the original search might have missed something, not because investigators failed, because time had changed the landscape. The swamp moved, the earth shifted, trees grew, paths disappeared. A place that looked empty in 1981 could hide an entire story decades later. Then an unexpected discovery appeared. A former wildlife officer contacted detectives after seeing news coverage about the reopened investigation. His name was Marcus Hale. He had been 22 years old when Rebecca disappeared. At the time, he was not involved in the investigation. He was simply a young officer patrolling remote areas. He told detectives something he had never reported. A week after Rebecca vanished, he found fresh tire tracks near a restricted hunting area. The tracks belonged to a heavy pickup. He remembered because vehicles were not usually allowed there. He wrote down the location. But when he returned the next morning to report it, his supervisor told him not to get involved. Too many people already looking. Marcus accepted that answer. He was young. He had no authority. He moved on, but he never forgot the location. The coordinates were entered into the investigation. A search team was deployed. The area was nearly impossible to reach. Thick vegetation, mud, standing water, the kind of terrain where every step felt uncertain. For 2 days, nothing was found. On the third morning, a technician noticed something unusual, a depression in the ground, not natural, a long rectangular shape beneath years of leaves and soil. The team stopped. Nobody spoke. They had searched for Rebecca for 40 years. Every investigator understood what that moment could mean. The area was carefully examined, slowly, patiently. Then came the discovery. Not a body. Not yet. A piece of fabric. Old. Faded, but preserved. The pattern matched clothing Rebecca was wearing the night she disappeared. The entire area was sealed. The investigation changed instantly. For decades, Rebecca had been a missing person. Now detectives believed they had finally found where the mystery ended. The excavation continued. Every inch was documented. Every object photographed. No one rushed. Because after 40 years, Rebecca deserved more than a quick discovery. She deserved the truth. Several items were recovered. A necklace, a small classroom key, fragments of personal belongings, evidence that confirmed what investigators had feared. Rebecca had never left Louisiana. She had never started a new life. She had never abandoned her family. She had been there all along, hidden in the place where someone believed nobody would look again. The news shook the community. People who had spent decades wondering finally had an answer, but answers sometimes bring more pain. Rebecca's mother was no longer alive to hear the news. The porch light she kept burning had gone dark years earlier. Neighbors remembered the promise she made. She wanted to know where her daughter was. She wanted to bring her home. Now, finally, Rebecca was coming home. But the investigation was not finished, because the discovery raised another question. Who placed her there? Daniel Voss remained the primary suspect, but investigators still needed to know if Raymond Cole was involved, and they needed to understand the role of the forgotten witness. The case had become larger than one crime. It was about the people who knew, the people who stayed silent, the people who watched the truth disappear. Detectives questioned Raymond Cole again. This time, they had evidence, the photograph, the employment records, the connection to Daniel. Raymond sat quietly during the interview, older, tired, no longer the confident man from 1981. When investigators placed the photograph on the table, he stared at it. "You should have forgotten this," he said. The room became still. Detectives asked, "Forgotten what?" Raymond looked away. For several minutes, he refused to speak. Then he finally said something that changed everything. "Daniel didn't do what everyone thinks." The detectives leaned closer. "What does that mean?" Raymond swallowed. "It means you don't know the whole night. A danger sentence. Because it suggested something investigators had never considered. Maybe Daniel Voss was not the only person responsible. Maybe the story they had been chasing for 40 years was incomplete." Raymond continued. He claimed Daniel was involved. He admitted they were both near the logging road that night. But he insisted something happened afterward that Daniel never wanted anyone to know. Something involving another person, another vehicle, another secret. Before detectives could get more details, Raymond stopped talking. His attorney arrived. The interview ended. But the damage was already done. The case had entered a new stage. The evidence had found Rebecca. The fingerprint had found Daniel. But the truth was still hiding behind another locked door, a door that had remained closed since the summer of 1981. And somewhere inside that missing piece of the story was the answer to the question investigators have been asking for decades. Why did Rebecca Landry never come home? This is a fictional crime story. For 40 years, the town had searched for a missing woman. Now they had found her. But finding Rebecca Landry did not end the nightmare. It opened another one. Because a discovery beneath the Louisiana wilderness answered the question everyone had feared. Rebecca had not disappeared. She had been taken. And the people responsible had lived with that secret while the world continued around them. Families grew. Children were born. Buildings changed. Seasons passed. But somewhere beneath ordinary days, the truth remained buried. The discovery site became the most important crime scene in Louisiana. Investigators worked slowly. Every object was photographed. Every fragment collected. Every piece of evidence carefully preserved. After 4 decades, patience mattered more than speed. The smallest detail could change everything. The recovered items created a timeline. Rebecca's belongings, her jewelry, her classroom keys, pieces of fabric, objects from a life interrupted. But one discovery stood above the rest. A small metal button found near the remains. At first, it seemed insignificant. Old clothing. Nothing unusual. Then forensic analysts examined it. The button carried a manufacturing mark, a company logo, a work uniform supplier, the same supplier that provided jackets for Bayou Gulf Construction, the same company where Daniel Voss and Raymond Cole worked in 1981. Another connection, another piece of the puzzle. But investigators still needed to understand the exact events of that night. They returned to Raymond Cole. This time, there was nowhere left to hide. The evidence was no longer a theory. It was a chain. Raymond knew it. He arrived with an attorney. He looked exhausted. Not like a man preparing to fight. Like a man preparing to finally stop running. Detective Brooks placed a photograph on the table. The blue pickup. The 2 men. The summer before Rebecca vanished. "Tell us what happened," Brooks said. Raymond stared at the picture. Then he whispered, "We were never supposed to be there." The room became silent. Raymond began telling the story he had buried since 1981. He said Daniel Voss had been obsessed with Rebecca, not in a way anyone noticed. Not openly. Daniel was the kind of person who disappeared into crowds. Quiet. Forgettable. The type of man people overlooked. According to Raymond, Daniel had watched Rebecca for weeks. He knew her schedule. He knew when she left school. He knew which road she traveled. Raymond claimed he tried to warn Daniel to stop. But Daniel laughed. He said nobody would ever suspect him. He thought he was invisible, Raymond said. On the night Rebecca disappeared, Raymond claimed Daniel asked him to drive with him. He said it was supposed to be a conversation. Nothing more. Raymond insisted he did not know what Daniel planned, but detectives noticed a weakness in that statement. 40 years earlier, Raymond had helped hide the truth. He had helped maintain the silence. Whatever his role, he was involved. The blue pickup traveled toward the logging road. Rebecca was already there. Exactly why remained unclear, but investigators believed Daniel had forced her vehicle off the main road. A confrontation followed. Rebecca fought back. The broken glass, the blood, the damage watch. The evidence all pointed to violence. Raymond admitted he saw the struggle. He admitted he heard Rebecca screaming. And then he admitted the sentence that changed the case forever. I left. Detective stared. You left? Raymond nodded. I got scared. Then what happened? Raymond looked down. Daniel told me he would handle it. Those words were devastating, because they meant Raymond had made a choice. He had walked away. He had allowed Rebecca to disappear. He had protected himself. For decades, the detectives asked about the body. Raymond claimed he did not know where Daniel took her. He said when he returned the next morning, Daniel's truck was damaged. The driver's window was broken. Daniel's hand was injured. Raymond remembered seeing blood, but he never asked questions. He never wanted answers. He simply wanted distance. Why didn't you go to police? Brooks asked. Raymond laughed quietly, not because it was funny, because he hated himself, because I was a coward. The confession was emotional, but investigators still needed proof. Raymond's story needed to match the evidence, and surprisingly, it did. The broken window, the injury, the blood, the fingerprint, the witness account, the recovered items. Piece by piece, the impossible story became real, but there was still one person missing. Daniel Voss, the man at the center of everything, the man whose fingerprint had waited 40 years, the man who had built a normal life on top of an old secret. Detectives knew they could not rush. A mistake could destroy the entire case. They needed to find Daniel. They needed to bring him in. They needed answers directly from him. The search for Daniel intensified. His home was placed under surveillance. His workplace was monitored. Investigators watched every movement. But something unexpected happened. Daniel disappeared. Not dramatically. Not like a movie. Quietly. One morning, his co-workers noticed he never arrived. His phone was turned off. His vehicle was gone. His house was empty. The man who had spent 40 years avoiding the past had suddenly started running again. The investigation became a race. Detectives tracked financial activity, a fuel purchase, a hotel reservation, a highway camera. The trail moved south, back toward Louisiana, back toward the place where everything began. The same state, the same roads, the same humid air. After 40 years, Daniel Voss was returning to the scene. He believed he had escaped forever. Authorities followed the trail through small towns and forgotten highways. Then came the call. A motel clerk recognized a photograph. A man had checked in under another name. Older. Gray hair. But the same eyes. The clerk remembered because Daniel had asked a strange question. Is the old logging road still there? The detective, hearing the report, felt a chill, because people rarely return to places they fear, unless something inside them is unfinished. A team was dispatched immediately. They arrived before sunrise. The motel was quiet, the parking lot empty. Room number 7 stood locked. Detectives surrounded the door. They announced themselves. No response. They entered carefully. The room was empty. But Daniel had not escaped without leaving something behind. On the table sat an old newspaper clipping, a photograph of Rebecca, a handwritten note. Only one sentence. I should have told the truth. The detectives looked around the room. Daniel was gone. Again. But this time, the evidence was different. This time, they knew exactly who they were chasing. And they knew something else. Daniel Voss was no longer running from a cold case. He was running from the moment when the truth finally caught up with him. Because after 40 years of silence, the past was no longer buried. It was following him, and it was getting closer. This is a fictional crime story. The note left inside the motel room was only one sentence, 8 words. But after 40 years of silence, those words carried the weight of an entire lifetime. I should have told the truth. Detectives photographed it from every angle. They collected the paper, the handwriting, the fingerprints. Every detail mattered, because Daniel Voss had disappeared again. But for the first time, he was not an unknown shadow moving through the darkness. He was a man running from a truth that had finally found him. The investigation changed overnight. Before, detectives were searching for a suspect. Now, they were chasing a confession that had already started. Daniel had left behind something he could have destroyed, something he could have hidden. Instead, he left a note where investigators would find it. That raised a terrifying question. Was Daniel trying to escape, or was he trying to be found? The answer remained unclear. But detectives knew one thing. A guilty person runs. A broken person sometimes runs toward the only place where the truth still exists. The search continued. Every highway leaving the area was monitored. Every possible destination was examined. Investigators studied Daniel's entire life. The patterns became obvious. He did not travel randomly. He always returned to places connected to his past, places where he had worked, places where he had lived, places where nobody knew his real story. A man who spent decades hiding had created a map of his own escape, but every road eventually led back to Louisiana. The original investigation files were reopened again. This time, investigators looked at Daniel Voss differently, not as a stranger, not as a random suspect, as someone who had been part of the community. They discovered more about his time before Rebecca disappeared. Daniel had arrived in the parish months earlier. He rented a small house outside town. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, almost invisible. He fixed engines, worked long hours, never caused trouble. Nobody suspected him. Nobody had a reason to. That was what made the case so disturbing. The person closest to truth had been hiding in plain sight. Detectives interviewed former neighbors. One woman remembered something unusual. A few days before Rebecca disappeared, Daniel had asked about her, not directly. He had asked what time the school usually closed. At the time, nobody thought anything about it. Now, that simple question felt different. Another neighbor remembered seeing Daniel's blue pickup parked near the school. Not once. Several times. The information had never been reported because nobody considered it important. A vehicle. A question. A quiet man watching from a distance. Individually, nothing. Together, everything. The case grew stronger. But Daniel was still missing. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected place. A retired bus driver contacted investigators. His name was Walter Price. He had seen news reports about the reopened case. Something bothered him. A memory he had buried. In 1981, Walter drove a rural route near the logging area. On the morning after Rebecca disappeared, he remembered seeing a blue pickup parked beside a dirt road. The driver was standing outside, washing his hands. Walter remembered because the man looked nervous. He kept looking toward the road. When Walter slowed down, the man turned away. At the time, Walter assumed nothing. People parked in remote areas all the time. But 40 years later, he recognized a photograph. Daniel Voss. The witness list kept growing. The silence that had protected the killer was breaking apart. Every person who had carried a small piece of the truth was finally putting it down. But one question remained. Where was Daniel going? Investigators traced his last known movements. A credit card transaction appeared. A small gas station near the edge of the parish. Security footage showed an elderly man entering. Gray hair, baseball cap, slow movements. But the posture was unmistakable. Daniel Voss. He'd purchased water, a map, and a disposable phone. The detective watching the footage noticed something. Daniel looked directly at the security camera. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Almost as if he wanted someone to know where he had been. The investigators followed the location of the disposable phone. It led them deeper into rural Louisiana. toward the same area where Rebecca's remains had been found, the same place where Daniel believed his secret had been buried forever. The search team moved before sunrise. Fog covered the roads, the kind of morning that made the past feel alive. They found Daniel's vehicle near an abandoned hunting cabin. The engine was cold. The driver's door was open. Inside were several items: a wallet, a photograph, an old newspaper clipping, and a small notebook. The notebook contained pages of writing, not a confession. Not exactly. More like a man arguing with himself for decades. Dates, memories, names, regrets. One entry stood out. August 18th, 2011, 30 years after Rebecca disappeared. Daniel had written, "I thought time would make it smaller. It only made it heavier." Another entry. "Every year I hear that road again." Investigators continued reading. The final page was unfinished. Only a few lines. "I went back because I need to see the place one more time. I need to know if I can finally say her name." Detectives looked at each other. Daniel was nearby, somewhere, watching, waiting. The search expanded around the cabin. Then, just before sunset, a deputy noticed movement near the old logging trail. A figure walking slowly through the trees. No weapon. No attempt to hide. Just an old man walking toward the road. Daniel Voss. After 40 years, the man whose fingerprint had started the investigation was finally standing in front of the people who had searched for him. He looked older than his years. Exhausted. Not surprised. The detective approached carefully. "Daniel Voss?" The old man stopped, closed his eyes, then nodded. "Yes." No running. No denial. No excuses. Just one word. "Yes." The arrest was quiet, almost peaceful. There were no dramatic chase scenes, no confrontation, no escape. Only a man finally facing the moment he had spent decades avoiding. During transport, Daniel said very little, but before entering the vehicle, he looked toward the trees, toward the place where Rebecca's life ended, and he whispered something investigators almost missed. "I'm sorry." The words were not for them. They were not for the cameras. They were for someone who could no longer hear them. The arrest shocked the community. People who had waited 40 years finally had an answer. The cold case that had defined generations was no longer cold. The headline appeared everywhere. "Louisiana 1981 cold case solved. Forgotten fingerprint leads to arrest." But for investigators, the arrest was only the beginning, because solving a cold case is not only about finding a suspect. It is about reconstructing the truth. And Daniel Voss still had to explain what happened on that summer night. He still had to answer why Rebecca Landry never returned home. He still had to explain who helped him. And he still had to reveal the final details of a mystery that had haunted Louisiana for more than 4 decades. The fingerprint had found him. The witness had spoken. The evidence had survived. But the complete story was still locked inside the mind of the man who carried it all these years. And now, for the first time, investigators were about to hear it. This is a fictional crime story. The interrogation room was smaller than Daniel Voss expected. A plain table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner, a single light hanging above, no dramatic walls covered with photographs, no piles of evidence placed in front of him, just silence. The same silence that had followed him for 40 years. Daniel sat with his hands folded, older, slower, different from a man investigators saw in the 1981 records. But the fingerprint had erased any doubt. The past had finally reached him. Detective Daniel Brooks entered the room carrying a thin folder, not a box, not hundreds of pages, just one folder. Inside were 4 decades of unanswered questions. Brooks placed the folder on the table. He did not open it. He did not need to. Daniel already knew what was inside. Rebecca Landry. Brooks said. Daniel looked down. His expression changed. Not anger. not confusion, recognition. A name he had spent decades trying not to hear. "You remember her," Brooks said. Daniel remained silent. The detective waited. Cold cases often ended the same way. Not with a dramatic confession, not with a sudden breakdown, but with a moment when the person finally realized there was nowhere left to hide. After several minutes, Daniel spoke. "I remember everything." The words were quiet, almost impossible to hear, but they changed the entire investigation. For 40 years, detectives had searched for facts. Now they finally had the person who carried the missing pieces. Daniel explained that he first noticed Rebecca months before her disappearance. At first, he described it as harmless. He saw her around town, at the grocery store, at community events, outside the school. He convinced himself he was only interested, that he was simply curious. But over time, curiosity became obsession. He began learning her routine, the time she arrived, the road she traveled, the places she stopped. The details investigators had discovered over the years suddenly made sense. The questions about the school schedule, the blue pickup near the school, the repeated sightings, the waiting. Daniel had not been a stranger passing through. He had been watching. The detectives listened without interrupting. Every word mattered. Because obsession was not an accident. It was a decision repeated again and again. Daniel admitted he knew the route Rebecca took home. He knew the isolated roads where nobody would notice a vehicle parked for several minutes. He knew the logging road. He knew the darkness. And on August 18, 1981, he made a choice that changed dozens of lives forever. Daniel admitted he followed Rebecca, but he insisted something unexpected happened. He claimed he did not plan to kill her. He claimed he wanted to talk, to confront her, to tell her how he felt. Detectives did not believe that explanation, not completely, because planning someone's movements for weeks was not an innocent act. Waiting for someone on a deserted road was not an innocent act. Hiding a vehicle was not an innocent act. Daniel continued. He said Rebecca noticed a truck behind her. She became frightened. She drove toward the logging road because she thought she could lose him there. But Daniel followed. When she stopped, the confrontation began. The evidence matched. The broken glass, the blood, the damaged vehicle, the struggle. Daniel said Rebecca fought harder than he expected. She screamed. She scratched him. She tried to escape. The fingerprint inside the door, the blood on the watch, the evidence left behind. All of it suddenly had a story. But then Daniel said something unexpected, something investigators had not expected to hear. Raymond wasn't supposed to be there. The room became silent. For years, investigators believed Raymond Cole was a participant. Now, Daniel's statement created a new question. What exactly was Raymond's role? Daniel explained that Raymond had followed him earlier that evening. He said Raymond knew something was wrong. He claimed Raymond arrived after the confrontation had already started, but he admitted Raymond saw everything. He could have stopped it, Daniel said, but he didn't. The detectives asked the question that had haunted them. What happened to Rebecca? Daniel closed his eyes. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he answered. I panicked. The words sounded small, almost meaningless, but the consequences behind it were enormous. Daniel described moving Rebecca away from a vehicle. He described the fear, the confusion, the moment when he realized there was no going back. He admitted hiding the evidence. He admitted taking her belongings. He admitted returning later to make sure nobody found her. But detectives noticed something. Every time he described his own actions, he used careful words, words designed to create distance. I panicked. I made mistakes. I lost control. Investigators had heard similar statements before. People often describe their crimes as accidents, as moments, as things that simply happened, but the evidence showed something different. This was not one decision. It was a series of decisions. Following Rebecca, watching her, choosing a location, hiding the vehicle, remaining silent, running away, living normally. For 40 years. The interview continued for hours. Daniel revealed more details. Details only someone present could know. The location of Rebecca's belongings, the position of the vehicle, the condition of the scene. Investigators compared his statements with the evidence. The matches were undeniable. But one mystery remained: the missing camera. The small camera Rebecca carried everywhere. The camera that disappeared with her. Detectives asked about it. Daniel became quiet. For the first time during the interview, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. I didn't keep it. Then where is it? Daniel looked at the table. Raymond took it. That statement changed everything, because it suggested Raymond Cole had not only witnessed a crime, he had taken something from the scene, something that might explain what really happened. The detectives immediately requested another interview with Raymond, but Raymond had already been released under supervision. When officers arrived at his home, they discovered the door unlocked. The house was empty. On the kitchen table sat a single envelope. Inside was a photograph, Rebecca's missing camera, the object investigators had searched for since 1981, along with a handwritten note. 3 words. She saw everything. The meaning was unclear, but the implication was terrifying. What had Rebecca photographed before she disappeared? Who was she trying to capture? And why had Raymond kept the camera hidden for 40 years? The cold case had been solved, but the mystery was not finished, because a fingerprint had identified Daniel Voss. The confession had explained the disappearance, but the camera suggested a deeper secret, a secret involving another person, another motive, another reason someone wanted the truth buried. And as detectives examined the recovered camera for the first time in 4 decades, they realized something that changed the entire case. The final piece of evidence had not been lost. It had been waiting, hidden, protected by the very person who helped keep the truth away. This is a fictional crime story. The camera sat inside an evidence bag for the first time in 40 years. A small object, scratched, weathered, almost forgotten. But to investigators, it represented something much larger. It was the last missing piece of Rebecca Landry's final day. For decades, everyone assumed the camera had disappeared because the killer wanted to destroy evidence. But now detectives face a different possibility. Someone had kept it. Someone had protected it. Someone had carried a piece of Rebecca's life through 4 decades of silence. The evidence room became completely quiet as technicians carefully opened the package. Nobody touched the camera without documentation. Every movement was recorded, every fingerprint preserved. The same careful process used for evidence from a recent crime, even after 40 years. Because time does not erase the truth, it only hides it. The camera was examined. The exterior showed signs of damage. The lens was cracked. The battery compartment was corroded. At first, investigators feared the film inside would be destroyed. Then the technician delivered unexpected news. The film was still there. A roll of photographs taken during the final hours of Rebecca's life. The room changed instantly. This was no longer an investigation built only on memories. They had images, a silent record, a witness that could not be frightened, could not change its story, could not forget. The film was transported to a forensic imaging laboratory. Specialists worked slowly. The old negatives were fragile. One wrong movement could destroy decades of evidence. Hours passed. Then the first image appeared. Rebecca's classroom. Children's artwork on the walls. Colorful drawings. A normal day. A peaceful moment before everything changed. The second image. Rebecca smiling beside her car. The same pale blue sedan investigators had searched for. The third image. The school parking lot. Nothing unusual. Then the fourth image appeared, and everyone stopped. A blue pickup truck, parked across the street, partially hidden. The image quality was poor, but the vehicle was unmistakable. The same truck, the same shape, The same connection that had appeared throughout the entire investigation. Investigators continued. More photographs emerged. Rebecca had unknowingly documented the beginning of her own tragedy. The images showed the truck appearing in different locations. Near the school, near a grocery store, near a road intersection, always distant, always watching. Then came a photograph that changed everything. The final image on the roll, taken shortly before Rebecca disappeared. It showed the inside of her car, a reflection in the rearview mirror, a person standing behind the vehicle, a face, blurred, but visible. The person was not Daniel Voss. The room went silent. For 40 years, investigators believed there were only two people involved, Daniel, Raymond. Now the camera suggested someone else had been present, someone they had never identified. The image was enhanced. The face remained unclear, but one detail became obvious. The person was wearing a jacket, a Bayou Gulf construction jacket, the same type of uniform connected to the missing button found near Rebecca's remains. The same company, the same circle. Another secret. Detectives returned to Raymond Cole. This time, they knew he had lied. They knew he had hidden the camera. They knew he had kept evidence away from investigators for decades. The question was why. Raymond agreed to speak, but he looked different. Broken. The confidence was gone. The investigators placed the photograph on the table. Raymond stared at it. Then he whispered, "I knew this day would come." Detective Brooks asked, "Who was the person in the photograph?" Raymond did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the floor. Then he said a name nobody expected. Michael Graves. The room changed. Because Michael Graves was not a stranger. He was a supervisor of the Bayou Gulf construction crew in 1981. The same supervisor who had disappeared from the original investigation. The same man whose records were incomplete. The same person who had access to employee information. And the same man who had died 5 years earlier. The detectives immediately searched his background. They found something disturbing. Michael Graves had been interviewed during the original investigation, but only once. A short conversation. No follow-up. No detailed examination. The report described him as cooperative, helpful, unimportant. But now investigators saw something different. Michael Graves had controlled the construction site. He knew the area. He knew the workers. He knew Daniel. He knew Raymond. And according to the old records, he was one of the few people who knew Daniel had injured his hand after Rebecca disappeared. The question became obvious. Why was he never investigated further? The answer appeared buried inside another forgotten document. A handwritten note from Detective Harold Mercer, the same detective whose notebook reopened the case. The note was never included in the official report. It contained one sentence. Someone higher up wants this investigation quiet. For decades, nobody knew what Mercer meant. Now detectives believe they understood. The original investigation had not only failed, it may have been interrupted. Someone had influenced the direction. Someone had pushed investigators away from certain questions. The Cole case was transforming again. It was no longer only about Rebecca's disappearance. It was about a network of silence. People who knew. People who protected. People who decided the truth was too dangerous. Raymond finally revealed the missing information. He admitted Michael Graves arrived at the logging road after Rebecca disappeared. He admitted Michael helped move evidence. He admitted Michael threatened them both. Nobody talks, Raymond said. That was the rule. Detectives asked why. Raymond looked toward the window. Because he knew things about everyone. The statement opened another investigation. Michael Graves had spent years building influence in the community. He knew people's secrets. Financial problems, personal mistakes, family issues. He used information as protection. Nobody wanted to challenge him, not even after Rebecca disappeared, especially not after. But one question remained. Why would Michael Graves help Daniel? What was his connection to Rebecca? The answer came from an old employee file. Rebecca had once reported a problem at the school, a complaint involving a construction worker who entered the property without authorization. The complaint was never considered serious. The name of that worker? Michael Graves. A forgotten report. A forgotten warning. A forgotten piece of paper that sat untouched for decades. Until now, the entire case suddenly connected. The truck, the witnesses, the silence, the missing camera, the ignored complaint. The investigators realized something terrifying. Rebecca had not simply encountered a random criminal. She had crossed paths with people who believed they were untouchable. But Rebecca had something they never expected. Her camera, her photographs, her final evidence. Even in the final moments of her life, she had unknowingly left behind the path to the truth. And now, 40 years later, that truth was finally visible. But there was one final problem. Michael Graves was dead. He could never answer questions. He could never face a courtroom. He could never explain why he helped hide what happened. Yet investigators knew something important. A dead suspect does not erase a crime, and a missing confession does not erase evidence. Because Rebecca's camera had done what witnesses could not. It had remembered everything. And after 4 decades of silence, the final chapter of Louisiana's most haunting cold case was about to be written. This is a fictional crime story. For 40 years, the people of Louisiana had lived with a question that never stopped echoing. Where was Rebecca Landry? The question followed families through generations. It followed investigators into retirement. It followed witnesses into old age. It followed the people responsible into ordinary lives where they pretended the past had disappeared. But the past does not disappear. It waits. And in the end, it was not one piece of evidence that solved the mystery. It was everything. The fingerprint, the forgotten witness, the hidden camera, the damaged watch, the old notebook, the voices of people who had carried the truth in silence for decades. One by one, they came together, and the story of what happened on that August night in 1981 was finally reconstructed. Daniel Voss was charged based on the evidence recovered after decades. The fingerprint from Rebecca's car, the DNA from the broken watch, his own statements during interrogation, the testimony from witnesses, the recovered evidence from the logging road. For the first time, Rebecca Landry's name was no longer connected only to the word missing. She was no longer a photograph on a poster, no longer a headline from a forgotten newspaper. She was a person again, a teacher, a daughter, a friend, a woman whose life had been interrupted by a moment of violence and a lifetime of silence afterward. The trial became one of the most watched cases in the region. People who had grown up hearing Rebecca's story returned to the courthouse. Some were there for justice. Others were there because they needed to see the ending of a story that had shaped their community for decades. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors did not focus only on the night Rebecca disappeared. They focused on the years that followed, the 40 years of choices, because the crime did not end when Rebecca vanished. It continued. Every day someone stayed silent. Every year someone ignored the truth. Every time someone chose comfort over justice. The prosecution showed the jury the evidence, the fingerprint, a silent mark left behind by someone who believed time would erase it, the photograph from Rebecca's camera, a final glimpse of the people connected to her disappearance, the notes written by investigators who refused to let the case die, and the testimony of Eleanor Batiste, the woman who had spent most of her life afraid. When Eleanor entered the courtroom, the room became completely silent. She was older now. Her voice was weaker, but her memory was clear. She told the jury about the blue pickup, the man watching Rebecca, the phone call, the fear, the decade she spent wondering if speaking the truth would put her family in danger. "I thought silence would protect me," she said. Then she paused. But silence only protected him. Those words spread beyond the courtroom, because they represented the heart of the entire case. The truth had not disappeared. It had been trapped by fear, by manipulation, by people who convinced themselves they had no choice. But eventually, someone chose to speak, and that changed everything. Daniel Voss listened quietly throughout the trial. He rarely looked at the audience. He rarely looked at Rebecca's family. But on the final day of testimony, something changed. A photograph of Rebecca was displayed in the courtroom, a young woman smiling. Before the fear, before the disappearance, before the headlines. Daniel stared at the image for several seconds. Then he lowered his head. For the first time, the courtroom saw not the suspect, not the fingerprint, not the name from a cold case file. They saw a man finally forced to face the human cost of what he had done. The verdict came after hours of deliberation. Guilty. The word traveled quickly. After 4 decades, the case was officially closed. But closure was complicated, because solving a mystery does not bring back the person who was lost. It does not erase the years families spent waiting. It does not return birthdays, holidays, conversations, ordinary moments stolen forever. Rebecca's remaining family members spoke outside the courthouse. They did not celebrate. They remembered. They talked about the young woman Rebecca had been, the teacher who loved her students, the daughter who called home every night, the person who deserved to live a full life. They said the same thing investigators had repeated throughout the case. The truth mattered, even when it arrived late, especially when it arrived late. Months after the trial, the town changed. The old logging road was no longer just a place people avoided. It became a reminder, not of the crime, but of the people who refused to forget. A small memorial was placed near the community center, not a monument to tragedy, a place to remember Rebecca. Her photograph stood beside a simple message. Some voices are silent, some truths wait, but justice remembers. The investigation also changed how local authorities viewed old cases. Files that had been ignored were reviewed. Evidence storage procedures were updated. Old fingerprints were digitized. Old witnesses were contacted. Because Rebecca's case proved something investigators already knew, but sometimes forgot. A cold case is not a dead case. It is a case waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right person willing to look again. Years later, Detective Daniel Brooks returned to the evidence room. The original fingerprint card was still there, the same print that had sat untouched for decades. He looked at it for a long time, a small pattern of lines, nothing more. Yet those lines had carried the truth across generations. A fingerprint from a forgotten night, a message left by someone who believed he would never be found. Brooks later said the most important lesson from the case was simple. Evidence doesn't forget. People forget. People lie. People become afraid. But evidence waits. The camera waited. The fingerprint waited. The notebook waited. The truth waited. And after 40 years, it finally spoke. The story of Rebecca Landry began with a disappearance, a quiet road, a missing car, a town filled with questions. But it ended with something stronger. An answer, not the answer anyone wanted, not the ending Rebecca deserved, but the truth. And somewhere in Louisiana, beneath the same humid skies that watched the mystery begin decades earlier, people finally stopped asking what happened to Rebecca Landry, because they finally knew she had not been forgotten. She had been waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to look again, waiting for the smallest piece of evidence to break the silence. And when that moment finally came, the cold case that everyone thought would remain unsolved forever became the case that proved one undeniable truth. Time can hide a secret, but it cannot protect it forever.